Daniel Rivers thought he had found his perfect bride in Alina Cruz, but just 7 days after their wedding, a shocking revelation on their honeymoon turned their love into horror-rending in a brutal killing that would expose the darkest side of truth, identity, and rage. Daniel Rivers had never been the type to chase romance. He was quiet, practical, and deliberate in everything he did. At 32, he worked as a construction supervisor in a small Ohio town, known for his discipline and calm demeanor. His life was predictable: early mornings, long workdays, quiet evenings, spent alone. Friends often teased him about being too serious, too cautious to ever fall deeply in love. But that changed the moment he met Alina Cruz. She entered his life like a spark in a dull room, radiant, poised, and full of warmth that seemed to melt through his guarded exterior. They met through a dating app, one Daniel had joined half-heartedly after constant pressure from friends. Alina's profile stood out from the rest. Her smile was soft, her words kind, and there was something mysterious about the way she described herself, a woman who had rebuilt her life from scratch. To Daniel, that sounded admirable. He admired resilience, and Alina carried herself with quiet strength. Their first few messages turned into long conversations that stretched late into the night. She spoke about moving from another state, starting over, and finding peace after years of struggle. Daniel, usually reserved, found himself opening up in ways he never had before. Over the next few months, they became inseparable. Alina was everything he thought he wanted: gentle, affectionate, and endlessly supportive. She listened to his worries about work, encouraged his dreams of starting his own company, and made him feel understood. When he introduced her to his small circle of friends, they were surprised at how happy he looked. Even his parents, who had always doubted he'd ever settle down, approved of her instantly. She seemed perfect too perfect, perhaps, but Daniel, blinded by love and the warmth of companionship, never questioned it. What Daniel didn't know was that Alina carried a secret she had hidden for years. Before she met him, she had undergone a transition, leaving behind a painful chapter of her life. Her past had been marked by rejection, struggle, and the constant fear of never being accepted for who she truly was. When she met Daniel, for the first time in years, she felt seen, not for her past, but for the person she had become. She wanted to tell him, to share the truth, but fear held her back. Their love had grown so fast, so bright, that she was terrified the truth would destroy it. Every time she planned to tell him, she convinced herself to wait just a little longer until the right moment. Until she was sure his love was unbreakable. After 6 months, Daniel proposed. He did it on a quiet evening in December, in front of a small lake where they often sat together. Alina cried, overwhelmed by emotion. She said yes, and though happiness flooded her heart, it was mixed with a deep, silent dread. She promised herself that she would tell him before the wedding, but when the day came, she couldn't bring herself to speak the words. Their wedding was simple but beautiful. Close friends and family gathered in a small chapel, surrounded by flowers and laughter. Daniel looked at Alina as though she were the only person in the world. To everyone watching, they seemed like the perfect couple, two souls meant for each other. The following day, they flew to Florida for their honeymoon, ready to start their new life together. For the first 6 days, everything was blissful. They walked along the beaches, watched sunsets from their balcony, and shared quiet dinners under candlelight. Daniel felt at peace, more content than he ever remembered being. Alina, though smiling, carried an invisible weight in her chest. She knew the truth couldn't stay buried forever. On the 7th day, that truth would surface in a way she never expected, through a single message on her phone that would change both of their lives forever. The love story that began with warmth and laughter was about to turn into something dark, irreversible, and tragic. The 7th day of their honeymoon began like any other. The morning sun poured through the balcony curtains, lighting up the white sheets tangled around them. Daniel brewed coffee while Alina stood by the mirror, brushing her hair with slow, deliberate strokes. They had planned to go snorkeling later, followed by dinner at a nearby seaside restaurant. Everything seemed calm, normal, even happy, but underneath Alina's soft smile was the unease that had followed her all week, the fear that her secret, the truth she had buried deep, might find a way to rise to the surface. Around noon, while Daniel was out renting snorkeling gear, Alina's phone vibrated on the bedside table. A message appeared from an unknown number. Her hands trembled as she opened it. It was a screenshot of her old social media profile from years ago before her transition, along with a cruel message that read, "Does your husband know who you really are?" Her heart dropped. Someone from her past had found her, and now, the life she built was seconds away from collapsing. When Daniel returned, Alina was sitting on the edge of the bed, pale and shaken. She tried to act normal, but her silence didn't go unnoticed. He asked if something was wrong, and she simply said she wasn't feeling well. For the rest of the afternoon, she moved like a shadow, quiet and distant. Daniel assumed it was exhaustion from the trip, unaware that his entire world was about to unravel. That night, as they prepared for dinner, another message came in, this time while Daniel was in the room. The phone buzzed, and without thinking, he reached over and looked at the screen. The message was from the same number. "Ask your wife about her old name." His confusion turned into curiosity, then into disbelief as he scrolled through the attached photos. They were of Elena before her transition, standing with a different name, a different life. For a moment, time seemed to stop. He turned toward her, his face blank, his breathing heavy. Alina froze, every muscle in her body tightening. The air between them thickened with something cold and dangerous. She tried to explain, to calm him, to tell him that she had always intended to tell the truth, but her words only deepened the wound. Daniel's mind twisted with anger and humiliation. Everything he believed about their relationship suddenly felt like a lie. The hours that followed were a blur of chaos. Daniel's shock turned into rage. He stormed around the room, knocking over furniture, his voice growing louder as his thoughts spiraled out of control. Alina backed away, terrified, her tears mixing with trembling pleas for him to stop. The man she had loved for months, the one who had promised her forever, no longer looked like the same person. His calm composure had vanished, replaced by raw fury. Neighbors in the resort later recalled hearing thuds, muffled cries, and a loud crash. By the time hotel staff reached the door, everything had gone quiet. Inside, the room was in disarray: broken glass, overturned lamps, and bloodstains on the white sheets. Daniel was nowhere to be found. Alina lay motionless near the balcony, her body bruised, her face unrecognizable. Authorities arrived shortly after. Alerted by the staff, the romantic honeymoon suite had turned into a crime scene. The police immediately launched a manhunt, issuing an alert for Daniel Rivers. He had fled before anyone could stop him, leaving behind his passport and wallet, as though he had run in blind panic. As news spread, the story ignited a media storm. Reporters swarmed the hotel, trying to piece together how a seemingly perfect marriage had turned into tragedy in just 7 days. Social media erupted with speculation, judgment, and outrage. Some sympathized with Alina, while others cruelly focused on her identity, twisting the narrative into something hateful. What no one yet knew was that Daniel wasn't gone for good. He was hiding somewhere nearby, consumed by guilt, anger, and confusion, haunted by what he had done, and unsure whether he would face justice or destroy himself trying to escape it. Daniel fled into the humid night, his hands trembling and stained with blood he couldn't stop staring at. The lights of the resort faded behind him as he stumbled through the narrow back streets leading away from the beach. The sound of the ocean grew faint, replaced by the pounding of his heartbeat and the echo of his own labored breathing. Every few seconds he glanced over his shoulder, expecting flashing lights or police sirens, but there was only silence. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to disappear. The shock of what had happened still hadn't settled. His mind replayed the last few moments in the hotel room again and again, each time more distorted. He remembered shouting, pushing, the look of terror in Alina's eyes. He had lost control, something inside him snapping when he realized the truth she had hidden. To him, it wasn't just deception, it felt like the foundation of his life had cracked. The love he thought was real had turned into confusion, shame, and fury. But beneath all that rage was another emotion creeping in, not fear of being caught, but of facing what he had done. By dawn, Daniel found himself at a bus terminal, miles from the resort. He bought a ticket to a nearby town using cash from his pocket, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The driver didn't ask questions, and Daniel sat in the back, pressing his forehead against the cool window. Outside, palm trees blurred by, but his reflection in the glass held his gaze. His eyes were hollow, his jaw clenched tight. He looked like a stranger, someone he didn't recognize. Meanwhile, news of the murder spread quickly. Within hours, Alina's name and photo were everywhere. Reporters broadcasted from outside the resort, calling it the honeymoon horror. Details of Alina's identity surfaced online, igniting heated discussions. Some spoke of her with sympathy, painting her as a victim of intolerance and violence. Others twisted the narrative cruelly, using her truth to justify the tragedy. Authorities identified Daniel as the prime suspect, and his photo appeared across local and international networks. The manhunt expanded. Airports and train stations monitored for any trace of him. As the investigation unfolded, more of Alina's life came to light. Detectives discovered her medical records, her transition history, and the emotional letters she had written but never sent, one of which was addressed to Daniel. In it, she confessed her love and her fear of losing him, explaining that she wanted to tell him but couldn't find the courage. She had written, "I wanted you to love me for me. I hoped the truth wouldn't matter." The letter painted a picture of a woman who had suffered in silence, who had only ever wanted acceptance. Back in hiding, Daniel rented a small room under a false name in a rundown part of town. He stayed inside most of the time, curtains drawn, surviving on cheap food and bottled water. Every knock on the door made him freeze. Every sound outside felt like a threat. His mind was unraveling. He couldn't sleep without seeing Alina's face, her eyes, the fear, the way she tried to reach for him before everything went dark. Guilt began to eat at him, sharper each day, twisting his stomach and breaking through the wall of anger he had built. Detectives traced his movements through security footage. They discovered him boarding a bus the night of the murder and tracked it to the next town. Locals remembered seeing a man matching his description buying food and supplies. The circle was closing in, but Daniel didn't seem to notice. He spent hours pacing, whispering apologies into the air, unable to escape the memories that haunted him. When police finally received a tip about a suspicious man staying in a seaside motel, they moved in quietly, but by the time they arrived, Daniel was gone. In his room, they found torn pages from a notebook scattered across the floor, each one filled with frantic handwriting. Some pages were angry, others remorseful, and one simply read, "I never meant to kill her." It was clear he was losing his grip on reality. The man who once appeared calm and controlled was now running from more than just the law. He was running from himself. Daniel wandered through small coastal towns, always keeping his head down, blending into the background like a ghost. He changed his clothes frequently, shaved his beard, and sometimes slept on park benches or abandoned sheds near the beach. Every morning, he woke up drenched in sweat, haunted by flashes of Alina's face, the look of disbelief, the blood, the silence that followed. He couldn't erase it. It followed him like a shadow, growing darker each day. The news had made him a fugitive, but the guilt had made him something worse, a man already trapped inside his own punishment. By now, Alina's story had reached international headlines. News outlets portrayed her as a brave woman who had fought hard for her identity, only to lose her life to violence. Candlelight vigils were held in her memory. Activists demanded justice, using her name as a symbol of the struggle against intolerance and hate crimes. Meanwhile, the police continued to trace Daniel's every move. They discovered he had withdrawn small amounts of cash from ATMs across the coastline, following a pattern that helped narrow the search. They believed he was still nearby, unable or unwilling to flee the state. For Daniel, every passing day felt like a year. His sense of time dissolved as paranoia took over. He imagined seeing his face on posters, hearing whispers behind him at every cafe or gas station. Sometimes he thought he saw Alina standing in crowds, her hair blowing in the wind, her eyes fixed on him. The hallucinations grew stronger, a cruel manifestation of the guilt eating away at his sanity. He began talking to her in the dark, whispering apologies, begging for forgiveness that would never come. He wasn't running from the police anymore. He was running from the haunting weight of his own conscience. One evening, Daniel wandered into an old fishing town, exhausted and hungry. He found a small empty church near the edge of the water and slipped inside to rest. The smell of salt and dust filled the air. He sat in the back pew, staring at the dim light flickering from a single candle near the altar. The stillness of the place brought a strange calm, but it also forced him to confront the reality he had been avoiding. He thought about Alina's laughter, her kindness, her unwavering love. For the first time, he let the truth settle completely. She hadn't deceived him out of malice. She had simply been afraid, and his reaction, his violence, had taken her life away. Outside, the storm that had been building all evening finally broke. Rain lashed against the windows as lightning illuminated the coastline. Daniel sat there for hours, his hands clasped, whispering to himself. He didn't know what to pray for: salvation, punishment, or an end to the endless torment in his mind. Meanwhile, investigators were closing in. A store clerk from a nearby gas station had recognized Daniel's face from a wanted poster after he bought food and fuel. She quietly alerted the authorities, who began sweeping the area. Police cars arrived at dawn, spreading out through the town. The storm had passed, leaving behind a damp, gray silence. Inside the church, Daniel finally stood, exhausted but resolute. He knew he couldn't run anymore. As he stepped outside, a patrol car turned the corner. Their eyes met briefly, the fugitive and the officers who had been hunting him for nearly 2 weeks. For a split second, Daniel thought about running again, but then he stopped. His body felt heavy, and his mind was quiet for the first time since that night. He dropped to his knees on the wet pavement, his hands raised. Officers shouted commands, approached carefully, and cuffed him without resistance. The arrest made national news. Cameras captured Daniel being led away, soaked, pale, and trembling. The same man who had once appeared calm and respectable was now broken, hollow, and haunted. In the eyes of the world, justice had begun, but for Daniel, the real punishment had already been living inside him since the night he lost control. The courtroom was filled with a tense stillness that hung heavy in the air. Cameras lined the walls, reporters whispered into microphones, and spectators leaned forward in anticipation as Daniel Rivers was escorted inside. His one-sharp features were worn and sunken, his eyes empty, his posture slouched under the weight of what he had done. The man who once looked proud and composed now appeared small, fragile, and utterly defeated. When he took his seat beside his defense attorney, the entire room seemed to focus on him, the husband who had killed his bride only 7 days after their wedding. The prosecution began with a detailed timeline of events. They presented evidence collected from the hotel room: bloodstains, broken glass, and the phone that contained the messages which had ignited Daniel's rage. They spoke of Alina's final moments, of the fear she must have felt, and of the brutality she endured. Photos of the crime scene were shown on a screen, and even the most hardened reporters looked away. The prosecutor's words were calm but piercing, painting a picture of a man who had allowed anger and pride to destroy a woman's life. The defense argued that Daniel's actions were not premeditated but the result of an emotional breakdown, a sudden loss of control after discovering something he wasn't prepared to process. They described him as a man raised in a rigid environment, struggling with deep-seated notions of masculinity and shame. They didn't deny the crime but asked the court to see it as a tragic outburst rather than calculated murder. It was a plea for leniency, an attempt to salvage the remnants of a shattered life. Throughout the trial, Daniel rarely spoke. He sat silently, his eyes often fixed on the floor, his mind trapped in a cycle of regret. When the court showed Alina's final photos, the ones from her wedding day, where she looked radiant and full of hope, Daniel wept for the first time. The sight of her smiling face seemed to break through whatever walls he had built to contain his emotions. It wasn't just guilt that consumed him. It was the realization that he had destroyed the one person who had truly loved him. Witnesses testified about the couple's relationship. Friends described Alina as gentle and kind, someone who had finally found happiness after years of struggle. Others spoke about how devoted Daniel seemed before everything went wrong. Experts on gender identity and trauma took the stand, explaining the fear many transgender individuals live with, the fear of rejection, and the danger of being misunderstood. Their testimonies turned the trial into more than a murder case. It became a mirror held up to society, forcing people to confront the consequences of ignorance and intolerance. The verdict came after 3 weeks of testimony. The judge's voice was firm as he read the sentence. Daniel Rivers was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Some felt justice had been served, while others believed no sentence could truly make up for the life that was lost. Daniel didn't react. He simply nodded once, his eyes vacant, as if he had expected nothing less. In the days that followed, media outlets continued to dissect the case. Documentaries, opinion pieces, and talk shows debated who Daniel was: a monster, a broken man, or both. Alina's family issued a statement urging compassion and awareness, asking that her death not be reduced to sensational headlines but serve as a reminder of the dangers faced by those forced to hide their truth. They wanted her remembered, not for how she died, but for the courage it took to live as herself. Years later, inside a gray prison cell, Daniel sat by a small window, the world outside a blur of passing seasons. He spent his days in silence, haunted by the ghost of a woman whose laughter still echoed in his mind. Sometimes he wrote letters addressed to her, though he knew they would never be sent. In those letters, he spoke of remorse, of memories, of the unbearable weight of love turned to tragedy. The world had moved on, but he remained frozen in that moment, replaying the same day over and over, wishing he could change the past. In the end, the story of Daniel and Alina became more than a tale of violence. It became a warning, a reminder that secrets born from fear can turn deadly, that love without understanding can breed destruction, and that the truth, no matter how painful, is always safer than the silence that hides it.